Fiso, in July, you were appointed the chair of the Pacific Cooperation Foundation, which works to grow connectivity between Pacific nations. Now that we're in lockdown, borders are closed, and a lot of businesses across the Pacific are suffering financially, what is PCF doing to help support Pacific businesses in New Zealand and across the region?
Well, first thing, PCF is the voice of the Pacific. It's a connector, enabler, because you've got a few other organisations. You've got Pacific Trade and Invest that looks at Pacific trade into New Zealand. You've got Pacific Business Trust that looks at domestic business. So you've got some other organisations that do some things in the Pacific. But what we're trying to do is broker arrangements that are future focused. So at the moment we're focusing on, look, we're talking about opening up the bubble, but actually, we've got to say, well, why did you not discuss opening up the bubble first with the realm countries? Because they are New Zealanders. But you started talking about opening it up with Australia first. You talk about bringing home all these New Zealanders from offshore, but you've forgotten about the three realm countries who are actually New Zealanders. So, we are advocating for that. The other thing is, when you're talking about opening up the bubble and trade, those are economic terms, right? But actually, are we, that's good for the businesses who are trading. But if you think about what's happening in the Pacific, we're probably looking at a humanitarian issue, not a trade issue. There's a whole lot of people who probably are struggling to feed themselves. So are we talking about trade when you've got some companies who might do well out of it? Or are we looking at both trade and humanitarian? Now, why is it that we don't have freight being able to get to the Pacific? Our freight numbers have dropped significantly. So we should be trying to open up more ways of getting the freight there. Remittances. The banks are, to be fair, charging quite a bit for small amounts of money to go across the Pacific, but those amounts of money are significant. Yes. So we're looking at the fintech options of seeing what are the things that we can do to maybe circumvent the banks and have a finance structure, which means that we can increase remittances without increasing the costs. We can increase freight forwarding to make sure it's more efficient, and therefore getting the products and services and the people who are most interested and have a biggest investment in helping our Pacific, which is their own families. So it's quite a different, it's a dual role that we're playing. And I know I'm from an economic development private sector background, but I understand that this requires a different model. So, we're on lockdown anyway. And if you think about what's coming out of the Pacific to New Zealand, it's pretty minimal. 130 million was the total trade. Now, that is not enough to sustain all those Pacific countries. We're heavily reliant on foreign aid, but foreign aid is only at the behest and of the donors. So we've got to build a new structure that, we look at how do we build a banking system that goes from people here in Australia and America to the people in the Pacific. An alternative route to going to government foreign aid coming down.
Yeah, helping people to help themselves.
I think so, and I think being creative about it and being pragmatic about it, because, I think, people have got to realise that New Zealand is also in high stress. So when people talk about sending 750 million as part of the Pacific reset back to the Pacific, most New Zealanders think, why are we giving 750 million to the Pacific? When actually that 750 million is being used to bolster our own security, our own capability at our agencies and borders to respond to the Pacific. It's not actually we're giving them 750 million. So people in New Zealand might misinterpret that as being handouts to them. But we already give 600 million in aid. So which you're going to do one way or the other. You're better off putting in the productive sector and let them trade out of this issue.